Hello, it's Gene Tunney here. It's Saturday the 8th of August. Today I'd like to speak with you about what's been happening in Victoria. So we've had the imposition of the stage 4 lockdown this week with the curfew and the business closures. Absolutely extraordinary. There have been concerns about the impacts on supply chains, what it might mean for groceries in the supermarket. And there have been reports and there's been speculation about what it might mean for interstate migration. And this is something that's of interest to me because for many years I've been tracking or I've been paying close attention to net interstate migration from Victoria to Queensland. So historically, net interstate migration has helped drive Queensland's economy at different times. We had a high rate of net interstate migration in the late 80s and early 90s, for example. So I've been thinking about what the situation in Victoria might mean for net interstate migration, and I was prompted to do this by two items. Now today, Nick Cater, Nick is the Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre, so that's the think tank of the Liberal Party of Australia. In Nick's latest note, he wrote that Victoria is a state from which millions long to escape. The army and police are patrolling its borders and Melbourne residents are under virtual house arrest. Now, whether millions are longing to escape Victoria is debatable. I mean, they certainly wouldn't want to be there. Probably wish they were somewhere else at the moment during the stage 4 restrictions. However, it's unclear just how many might want to permanently leave once COVID's over. That said, there was a report by 9 News earlier in the week that suggests some clever Victorians have found a way to get out of Victoria and move to Queensland. So the 9 News report said that thousands of people have been taking advantage of a Queensland coronavirus border closure loophole to flee Victoria's state of disaster and move north. Under coronavirus restrictions, removalist operations are considered an essential service as part of freight and logistics. Anyone moving to Queensland, however, needs to prove they have an official lease or residency in the state, will need to quarantine in a hotel for a fortnight if they are coming from a virus hotspot, and will need a valid border pass to be able to cross the border. After all of that, travellers are free to begin a new life in the Sunshine State. I would certainly welcome an influx of Victorians post-COVID. I think it would be good for Queensland's economy and good for our society. So yes, I'd definitely be welcoming of Victorians. As I mentioned earlier, I've been tracking the net interstate migration from Victoria for a while now. There was a period in the middle of last decade, so the 2010s, when that went negative for a while, whereas historically we've tended to gain people from Victoria. Indeed, we gained around 20,000 people in the peak year for net interstate migration from Victoria. I think that was 93, so that was the year after Jeff Kennett was elected. And Kennett, of course, had a austerity program, lots of privatisation, lots of budget cuts, and that meant that lots of public servants lost their jobs and I think migrated up to Queensland. That's one possible explanation for that. This time of the late 80s and early 90s, remember, this was the time when Queensland was seen as somewhere exotic, somewhere far away, and it became a bit of a cliche for the soapies that if they had to retire a character, they would move to Queensland. I think Scott and Charlene from Neighbours, so Scott and Charlene played by Jason Donovan and Kylie Minogue, they ended up moving to Queensland if I remember correctly. Now, as I mentioned, at different times Queensland has been, it's had quite a high rate of interstate migration, and it's helped propel the economy, particularly in the late 80s and early 90s. So when we were gaining migrants from both New South Wales and Victoria, we had net interstate migration, so arrivals less departures, up around 50,000 people per annum. And if I remember correctly, I think it was Wayne Goss, who was Premier back in the 90s, who said that we have 1,000 people crossing the border every week to live in Queensland. So that's where that came from. But we saw net interstate migration drop substantially over the 2000s, and it's only been recovering in the last few years, and people in the property industry have been hoping that it would recover quite a bit more. I expect when we get the figures for 2020, we'll see a drop, because we won't be seeing people moving for work across the country as they once did, work or study, due to this disruption caused by coronavirus. But possibly when things get back to normal, we could see a pickup in net interstate migration. We could see a lot of Victorians wanting to come to Queensland. My final slide shows how the net interstate migration figures that I popped up before, how they're arrived at. They're the arrivals to Queensland from the different states and territories, less the departures from Queensland to those states and territories. So if you look at New South Wales, for example, you'll see that there are always more people arriving in Queensland from New South Wales than there are people departing from Queensland to go to New South Wales. So we've always had net positive interstate migration from New South Wales, as it should be. Victoria, on the other hand, over the last 10 years, those arrivals and departures have been closer together than in the past. And for a while, we had negative net interstate migration. I think it was around negative 1,000 people in each of those years where we had the net negative interstate migration from Victoria. So that's how those net interstate migration figures are worked out. Okay, so that's just a quick video with some of my thoughts on what the situation in Victoria might mean long term for Queensland. It may well mean that we end up getting more interstate migrants from Victoria as the horrible experience that people are going through during this lockdown and concerns about the quality of public administration in Victoria, those concerns may end up tipping people, or it may tip the balance, so to speak, and they may conclude they'd be better off in Queensland. So if you're in Victoria and you're thinking, I'm not really happy here, then certainly consider coming to Queensland. Once the restrictions are lifted I and other Queenslanders will be happy to have you up here. Okay. I hope you found this video informative, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon. Thank you.